Hi, my name's Nick Fears, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the University of North Texas Health Science Center, working with Haley Miller. Today, I'm going to be talking about how children with autism spectrum disorder use inefficient, goal-directed whole-body movements compared to typically developing children. Autism and motor problems. You may not often think about people with autism having motor problems, and that'd be easily understood. The core autism diagnostic criteria focus heavily on social communication and interaction, and restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. One place they do mention motor is in terms of stereotyped motor behaviors such as hand flapping or rocking, but we don't often think about these as motor problems. But what about motor problems in autism? Well, a recent prevalence study by Melissa Licari using a population-based cohort found a high rate of motor difficulties in children with ASD, and a recent paper by Anjana Bhatt using the Developmental Coordination Disorder Questionnaire found that as high as 87% of children with ASD are at a risk of motor disorder. Researchers have also begun to examine processes involved in motor differences in children with ASD. Matt Mosconi's group looked at postural control in standing and stepping, finding that children with ASD have less postural control during these movements compared to typically developing children. Researchers have also begun to use whole body movements to distinguish children with ASD from TD children. Specifically, Brittany Chavers and colleagues have found that children with ASD can be identified because of their more variable movements during video game play. And Stuart Mostofsky's group have found that decreased ability to imitate the movements of another person distinguish children with autism from typically developing children. In our lab, we measured children's movements using motion capture, mobile eye tracking, and force plates in combination with immersive virtual reality. This provides a highly controlled, safe, and engaging environment to study motor behavior in ASD. Today, I'm going to focus on motion capture data from one task, the safe zone task. The safe zone task requires children to move their bodies to move a user-controlled blue ball into a green safe zone. This ball is controlled by a marker on the C7 vertebrae, which is indicated by the gold star in the image on the right. And this requires children to lean or step to move to the safe zone. Children complete 16 trials, 8 on the left and 8 on the right at 2 distances. The near distance requires children to move 13.4 centimeters from the center of the screen, and the far distance requires a movement of 26.8 centimeters from the center of the screen. I should note that this is from the center of the screen, and children were not always able to start directly in the center of the screen on each trial because sometimes they were moving back from previous trials. So we have a continuous measure of distance to the safe zone. Moving on to our sample characteristics, the ASD group in this study had 16 participants diagnosed with ASD between 7 and 13 years with a mean age of 10.6. The TD group had 12 participants, none of which had a first-degree relative with ASD, between 7 and 13 years with a mean age of 9.3. Let's move on to some data. As we expected, children in both groups were highly successful at completing the task and hitting the safe zone. Both groups had hit rates over 88%, and there weren't any significant differences between the two groups. We did, however, see an effective distance, such that children were less successful at hitting the target at further distances compared to nearer distances, but this is to be expected. Differences did begin to appear, however, when we examined the nature of movements children were making to complete the safe zone task. Children with ASD used more time to reach the safe zone than typically developing children, and this was consistent across distances to the safe zone. So we see children with ASD at an elevated trial duration on the blue line and compared to typically developing children in the green line. Children with ASD also took less efficient paths to the safe zone. That is, when examining the ratio between the path that children took to the most direct path to the safe zone, children with autism had larger ratios, indicating less efficient paths compared to typically developing children. Again, these differences were similar across distances to the safe zone. Next, we looked at strategies and the errors that children were making when moving to the safe zone. TD children were more likely to overshoot near targets than far targets, and conversely were more likely to undershoot far targets than near targets. ASD children, on the other hand, do not seem to have a consistent movement strategy for completing the task. children with ASD made similar numbers of overshoots and undershoots for both near and far targets. Finally, I want to go over some take-home points that I think are important. First, many children with autism spectrum disorder exhibit substantial motor differences, and we need to begin to examine these differences and how they may impact the lives of children with ASD. Second, we've shown today that virtual reality can be a useful tool in measuring movements, providing a highly controlled, safe, and engaging environment. Third, we've shown that although children with ASD are successful in completing movement tasks, they're less efficient than TD children when completing whole body movements and may use less consistent movement strategies. By examining how children with ASD are completing these movement tasks, instead of focusing solely on whether they can complete these tasks, we can begin to understand the unique pattern of movement challenges experienced by children with ASD. Finally, it's important that we recognize that the increased time and effort that children with ASD use to complete whole body movements may have a negative impact on their ability to perform activities of daily living. It is imperative that children with ASD are routinely assessed for motor difficulties and that they receive adequate therapeutic intervention to improve their movement abilities. Finally, I want to thank our funders, NIH, Autism Speaks, UT Southwestern, NSF, and the UNT Health Science Center. And I want to thank all of the families and children who volunteered to make this research possible. Thank you.